If you've never heard a heart go from symphony to static in one breath, it sounds like a glass humming right before it cracks. I know because on the night I thought I'd be toasting 5 years of marriage, I stood in my own hallway holding a bouquet and a bakery box, and I listened to the kind of laugh you only make when you think no one can hear you. My name is Zaid Ibekwe. I used to believe the worst thing that could happen to you was a stranger breaking your trust. Then my brother proved me wrong. I was supposed to be at the restaurant. We had a 7:30 booking. I'd left my wife Myra an hour earlier with a kiss on the top of her head and a lie I thought was sweet, that I'd forgotten the dessert we ordered and I'd go back for it. The real plan was fireworks. I had the cake with the sugar lilies, the vintage of the wine from our first date, a playlist that started with the song we always skipped to because we could never wait for chorus. I had a key in my pocket and a memory in my chest. The way she looked at me that winter in Lagos when rain pinned us under a kiosk and we promised each other someday we'd be the storm and the shelter both. I don't know what made me take the long way home. Maybe the tie was too tight, maybe the wind said something I could finally hear. I turned onto our street with the windows cracked and my collar loosened and everything looked normal. Porch light on, curtains half closed, the kind of quiet you think means safety. I put the key in, turned the lock, heard the click, a sound so ordinary I want to sue it for false advertising, and walked into the scent of gardenias and our lemon floor cleaner. I would like to tell you I knew immediately, that my gut howled, that the house inhaled and told me its secret. The truth is smaller, it was just a light I didn't remember leaving on, and then Myra's laugh, and then a man's voice low saying her name like a secret he had earned. I stood in the doorway to the living room and watched a scene unfold in a frame I pay the mortgage for. 2 people, 1 couch, a distance of inches that, if you've ever loved, you know is the most dangerous unit of measure in the world. I remember details I shouldn't. The blue candle dripping on the coaster I carved out of walnut, the shoe Myra always kicked off near the lamp because she hates feeling contained, the small white scar on my brother's wrist from when we were kids and he tried to cut mangoes too close to the bone. Ezra turned his head at the exact pace of a person emerging from a dream. Our eyes met and I watched the realization walk across his face. I was still holding the cake. The box slid, the lilies smudged. A sugar petal stuck to my shoe. Nobody spoke first. There's a silence reserved for the moment you recognize the kind of betrayal that rearranges your family tree. It sat with us polite and heavy. Then Myra said Zaid, so softly it made me want to break every quiet thing in the house. Ezra stood because he's taller than me and men like him think up gives them dignity. Bro, he started, and I held up my hand like a stop sign you can bleed on. Don't, I said, and my voice surprised me with how calm it was. Don't call me that word right now. The human brain is a list maker when it's in trouble. Mine started inventorying. 5 years of marriage, 2 of dating. 16 years with Ezra as my older brother, my first fight partner, my first alibi, my first protector, my first bully, my first hero. 100 dinners at this table. 1,000 mornings Myra's hair smelling like citrus on my pillow. 1,000,000 little kindnesses. 1 5-second decision that set a match to it all. I wish I could tell you I played the righteous man and threw them out. I didn't. I set the cake down on the console table because I can't stand mess. I loosened my tie because it was choking a different part of me now. I said, you had all day to confess. You could have told me last week, last month, the first time you wanted this, but you waited until tonight. I looked at Myra and my voice broke on the last word like it was a thin branch. Why? She started crying in that pretty controlled way that used to soften me. We didn't mean, she said, and then stopped because even she heard how foolish that sounded in a house burning with intent. Ezra rubbed his mouth, a tic from childhood, the tell he uses when he's deciding whether to lie. It happened, he said finally, like the weather. You've been so busy, Z, you don't listen anymore. She listens. I laughed. It was a sound I didn't recognize and I hope I never hear it again. So that's the rule, I said. The person who listens owns the body. You two could have held 100 conversations in this house without tearing it apart. You chose this. Myra whispered, I'm sorry, like a password she hoped could unlock the old us. Ezra reached for my shoulder and I stepped back because I am not a man made of grace. I walked to the kitchen and turned on the kettle because that's what my mother does when the world ends. She makes tea as if boiling water is a form of prayer. I needed my hands to be busy with something that wasn't breaking. I leaned against the counter, felt the cool tile on my spine and asked the question that matters when you're counting the dead and the survivors. How long? Ezra said, a couple of months. Myra said, since June, which is not the same thing, and in that gap I saw a timeline of lies like a highway interchange. I didn't rage. The rage came later in waves that buckled me in grocery store aisles and in the quiet of my car at red lights. That night I did what I've always done when something terrible happens. I built a bridge of facts and forced myself to walk across. I asked for their phones. They handed them over the way children hand over slingshots after someone gets hurt. I scrolled. I didn't read every message. I read enough to know the weather pattern of their betrayal. windy on Wednesday nights when I had late meetings, storms on the Saturdays I played 5A-side football with my friends, clouds with pretty edges the day my mother texted a family picture and Myra sent back a heart while my brother wrote my people, and I nearly threw my phone at the wall. I handed their phones back and said, "Get out." The words tasted clean. Ezra looked at me like I had just evicted him from our childhood. "Where?" he asked, and it took everything I had not to say, to the part of the story where I no longer have to look at you. Instead I said, "Anywhere but here." Myra started toward me as if proximity could heal a wound made by trespass, and I put the island between us like a border. "Leave the keys," I said. "Leave your rings." She took off the band and the thin engagement ring we'd picked together in a shop where we told the clerk we liked simplicity. She set them down next to the kettle. Ezra dropped his house key on the counter, and it sounded like punctuation. Time does a strange expansion-contraction trick after catastrophe. An hour is both a blink and a lifetime. I don't remember them walking out. I remember the click of the door. I remember the kitchen going too quiet. I remember boiling water screaming and me forgetting why. I turned off the stove. I picked up the rings. I put them in a small bowl. I went into the bedroom we had painted soft gray and opened the window because the air in that room didn't want to touch me. If you're still here, this is the part where I tell you how the humiliation moved through my life like dye in water. It wasn't just the big things, calling my parents, canceling the dinner, telling our friends. It was the ordinary sounds that now wore teeth, a phone buzzing, the creak of the middle stair, laughter in the apartment upstairs that used to be background noise and now felt like mockery. People say betrayal is a cut. They forget to mention it's also a broadcast. Word got out, it always does. My aunt texted me an emoji I didn't know how to interpret. My boss put a hand on my shoulder and asked if I needed time off, and then moved the project I loved to another team because I seemed distracted. My mother cried on my voicemail and then made a pot of jollof and left it on my porch because feeding is her way of binding wounds. My father said little and then showed up on Saturday with a toolbox and fixed a cabinet door that had been loose since last spring. He tightened the hinge and said, "Things break." Then he looked at me with eyes I recognized in my own face. "We fix what we can, we put what we can't fix where it can't hurt us." Myra's mother called me twice. The second time she cried and said her daughter had made a mistake and was I a man of God. I said, being a man of God doesn't mean letting people set fire to the church and keep the hymn book. And then I apologized for being unkind to a woman whose child disappointed her. I was learning in real time how to be strong without becoming hard. Ezra sent me a long message on day 3 about how he'd always felt in my shadow. He listed my good grades, my promotions, the way Mum calls me first when the boiler makes a sound. He said he didn't steal me a wife, he found love where love lived. I read it twice. Then I responded with one sentence, "My shadow didn't ask you to lie to me." I blocked his number for a week so I wouldn't become a man who fights via paragraph. I will not tell you every tear. I will tell you what I built with them. I moved through the house like a curator, deciding what stays in the exhibition and what goes to the archive. The couch stayed. The knife set went. The blanket we brought back from that trip to Cape Town stayed because it warmed me. The framed photo of our wedding day went in a box labeled proof, and then I crossed it out and wrote past. I started running again, not because I love running, but because the sound of my breath counting felt like a thing I could trust. I went to therapy where a woman with steady hands said words like boundaries and allowable anger, and made me say them back until my mouth knew how to form the shapes. People wanted me to hate Myra loudly. I didn't. Hate is a fire that asks for more wood than I own. I let the legal process do the slow, boring work of division. When the papers came, I signed with a pen my father gave me when I graduated. My hand didn't shake. The lawyer asked if I wanted to take back her last name. I kept mine and let her slip out of my documents like a guest leaving a party early. Poetic justice came in a quieter suit than I'd imagined when I was awake at 3 a.m. rehearsing speeches I'd never give. It was Ezra being publicly shamed or Myra begging at my door under rain. It was an email from my company's HR. The community mentorship initiative I'd proposed 6 months before, the one that had been stalled in budget, was funded. They asked if I'd lead it. It was a text from my cousin on a Sunday. Saw Ezra at the bar. He asked if I think you'll ever talk to him. I said someday, not today. It was a voicemail from my mother where she said, "Your brother came to church. He sat in the back. He didn't take communion. That's a start." It was me sleeping 6 hours and dreaming of nothing. Months later, on a day so ordinary the sky didn't bother to be impressive, I saw Myra in town. She was at the farmer's market holding a bag of tomatoes wrong, the way people do when they haven't learned that fruit bruises even when you're careful. She saw me, I saw her. We stood on opposite sides of the stall and stared at two versions of a life that would never meet again. She stepped close enough that if we'd been a different kind of people we might have hugged. "You look well," she said, and it wasn't small talk. It was an admission of defeat and a blessing at once. "I am," I said, because it was true in the complicated way truth often is. She swallowed. "He left," she said, and I knew who without her saying the name. "A while ago, he said he needed to figure himself out." I wanted to say, "He used me to practice leaving," but that would have been cruel to a person already practicing being left. I said, "I hope you figure yourself out too." Then I bought the tomatoes I didn't need and walked away because sometimes mercy is measured in restraint. On the anniversary of the night I came home early, I cooked dinner for my parents. Imani, my best friend since secondary school, came over and arranged flowers the way she does when she can't fix me but can make the room kinder. My father asked me to carve the chicken, which is his way of handing over ceremony. My mother lit a candle. We ate and told stories that didn't require anyone to be a villain or a saint. After, my father stood on our little balcony and looked out at the patchwork of windows and said, "You can tell who's home by the light." He glanced at me. "We're glad you're home." I'm not perfect in this new life. I still check who's laughing when I hear laughter behind a closed door. I still feel a slap of heat in my chest when my phone lights up at night. I still find a sugar lily petal stuck in the corner of a drawer and have to sit down on the floor like a man who has run too hard. But mostly I am steady. I water the plant I thought I'd killed and it proves me wrong. I run 3 miles and give myself a medal in the shape of a cold shower. I teach a kid in our mentorship program how to interview without apologizing for wanting the job, and he texts me a photo of his offer letter and I feel something in me uncrumple. If you're listening because you're standing in your own doorway with your own cake or your own proof or your own breath held tight in your chest, here's what I learned in the furnace. Blood is not a hall pass. Marriage is not a hostage situation. Love without trust is theater and you are not required to perform. When people show you there it happened, you are allowed to choose your it won't happen here again. Keep receipts not to weaponize them but to remind yourself you didn't imagine the smoke. Guard your gentleness like it's an heirloom. And when you can, build something that didn't exist before your pain so your suffering obeys you instead of the other way around. The last thing I will tell you is small. On a Tuesday I took the cake stand out of the cupboard, washed it and baked a simple lemon loaf. No occasion, no story to prove. The house smelled like something bright. I put on the song we always used to skip to and let it play all the way through. It wasn't the same song anymore. It didn't have to be. I cut a slice, sat at the table I still own and ate it slowly. I looked at the front door and felt nothing sharper than gratitude that it was closed from the inside. Then I did something I never thought I would do on an anniversary night. I slept with the lights off and didn't fear the dark. Tell me this because I want to hear your honest, messy human answer. If you were me, who would you cut off first and who, if anyone, would you ever let back in? The strangest thing about survival is how ordinary it looks once the flames die down. 6 months after that night, people still asked if I was okay, but by then okay meant I'd learned how to live inside a scar. I still went to work, I still bought groceries, I still paid bills. To strangers my life looked like it had never cracked, but inside I was carrying an empty seat at every table, a shadow in every room. One evening after a long day of mentoring, I stopped at a coffee shop I rarely went to. It was the kind of place where people with laptops look like they're auditioning for a movie about inspiration. I ordered a black coffee and found a seat near the window, and there across the room sat Ezra. He was alone, head bent, hair grown longer than I'd ever seen it, hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. He noticed me at the same time. For a second neither of us moved, then he stood hesitant like a boy caught sneaking cookies instead of a man who broke a brother. He walked over and for the first time in my life Ezra looked small. "Zaid," he said quietly, almost like a question. I didn't invite him to sit but he did anyway, placing himself on the edge of the chair like someone ready to leave at the first sign of rejection. "I'm not here to excuse anything," he began, and I almost laughed because excuses had been his second language since childhood. I've been going to therapy. They told me I should try to own what I did. To you, to Myra, to myself." I sipped my coffee, let the silence grow teeth. He swallowed. "She left, months ago, said she couldn't carry what we'd done, said I reminded her too much of you." His eyes flicked up to meet mine. "She was right. I carried your ghost into that relationship, and it killed it before it could even live." For a long while I said nothing. My hand stayed steady on the cup but my chest felt like it had a war inside it. Finally I asked, "Why come to me now?" He exhaled, shoulders dropping. "Because you're my brother, and I know I lost the right to call you that, but it's the only word I have." I let his words hang between us, heavy and raw. Then I said, "You didn't just betray me, Ezra. You stole the one place I thought I was safest. You took my wife, and in doing that you took my trust, and trust doesn't regenerate like hair. It doesn't grow back just because time passes." His eyes shone but he didn't cry. Ezra never cried. "I know," he whispered. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I see it now, the wreckage, all of it." I stood, dropping a few bills on the table. "Then let that be your penance," I said. "Live every day knowing what you broke and build something honest out of it. Don't come to me for absolution. I'm not God." I left him there, hunched over the cold coffee, a man learning that some apologies don't come with redemption. Walking home, I realized something. I didn't need him to suffer for me to heal. Karma had already done its quiet work. He was living in the shadow of his choices. Myra had left with nothing but regret. And me, I had walked away with myself intact. That was more than enough. Weeks later, I got an email from one of the young men in our mentorship program. Subject line, I did it. Inside was a photo of him in a new uniform, first day at his new job, grinning like the world had finally admitted him. Thanks for not giving up on me, he wrote. You saw me when I didn't see myself. I closed my laptop and let myself cry, not because of loss this time, but because of gain. The proof that betrayal had not ended me, that resilience had found a home in me. And in that moment, I knew something I wanted to pass on to anyone still listening. You don't have to get revenge, you don't have to beg for apologies, you don't have to wait for closure. Sometimes the real justice is building a life so steady, so bright, so undeniably yours that no betrayal can touch it again. Hope doesn't knock, it slips under the door like light. I didn't notice it at first. I just woke up one Tuesday and the quiet in my apartment didn't feel like an accusation anymore. The kettle clicked, the plant on my sill lifted its leaves toward the window like it trusted the sun to keep its promise, and for the first time in a long time my chest wasn't a locked room. I started measuring my days by small proofs, shoes by the door in a straight line, a sink that didn't collect regret, a calendar with more things I chose than things I had to endure. The mentorship program took a new cohort, and I learned the names of kids whose shoulders were always braced for impact. I kept a jar on my desk labeled firsts and dropped scraps of paper in it. First time I ran 5 miles, first time I cooked jollof without calling my mother, first time I slept through a storm. It felt childish, it felt like recovery. People still asked about Ezra and Myra because gossip is a drought-resistant plant. I had a sentence I gave them that fit in one breath. They made their choices, I'm making mine. The ones who wanted blood were disappointed. The ones who wanted a sermon left satisfied. The ones who loved me heard the period and didn't try to turn it into a comma. On Saturdays, I ran the river path where the city remembers how to be honest. Concrete gives way to water, and even the buildings lean in to listen. I ran until my legs burned and my head went quiet enough that I could hear which thoughts were mine and which belonged to the past. Some weekends my father joined me on his bike, pretending he was there to keep me honest on pace, but really to keep me from running away from the life I was allowed to have. He'd coast beside me and say practical poetry, breathe on the count you can repeat. Look where you want to go, not where you're scared of. Pace is a promise, not a race. At work, the mentorship initiative turned into something with a heartbeat. We didn't just teach interview answers and firm handshakes. We taught the kids how to sit in a chair without apologizing for taking up space. We held mock meetings where they practiced disagreeing without shrinking. We brought in a photographer and did headshots against a gray backdrop that made everyone look like the most professional version of themselves. The first time Jamal, 18, brilliant, convinced he was a fluke, saw his photo, he said, I look like a person who got hired. I said, that's because you are, and the room warmed by 3 degrees. One afternoon, I took the train to see my mother because the kind of weariness I had couldn't be slept off. It needed to be cooked out of me. She made stew and didn't ask me any questions until my second plate. Then while she wiped the counter with the care of someone polishing a memory, she said, your brother has been coming to help Mrs. Bello with her fence. Her tone was neutral, a report, not a request. He's trying. I stabbed a piece of yam with my fork, less violent than I felt. Trying is better than lying, I said, which is the kindest I could manage. She nodded and then, with the precision of a woman who will not be misunderstood, added, trying is not owed forgiveness, but people should know their trying is seen. She didn't say she wanted me to forgive him. She didn't say I had to make the family whole again. She dried her hands and kissed my forehead and called me by my Yoruba name and sent me home with containers labeled in her tidy script. Love can be a sermon without mentioning God. That night I stood on my balcony and watched the squares of lit windows across the street, each a little theater. In one, a couple danced while stirring sauce. In another, a woman did yoga badly and laughed at herself and kept going. In a third, a man sat alone reading, his face unguarded in a way people rarely are when they're being watched. I didn't feel jealous. I felt invited, not to their lives, to mine. Ezra texted on a Thursday when the sky was so blue it felt like a favor. Can I help with your program? It said, no speeches, just chairs and forms. I stared at the message for a long time because sometimes healing looks like a trap from far away. Then I wrote, you can carry tables after sessions. We say hello, that's it. He replied, that's enough. I told the team to expect a volunteer named E. They didn't need his story. He didn't need their pity. When he came the first time, he was early and stood in the corner like a man trying not to be a problem. He lifted with his legs like our father taught us. He didn't seek me out. He didn't hang around. He left without a farewell. It was the most respectful I'd seen him in years. The second week, Jamal asked him how to drill a hole without cracking the plaster, and Ezra lit up like a street lamp turning on. He knows things like that, and knowledge gave him back a dignity that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the part of him that wasn't rotten. I allowed myself one private thought that did not cost me self-respect. Maybe people grow not to earn a place back, but so the place they stand now doesn't poison the ground. In therapy, I said out loud what I hadn't even written in my notes drawer. I was scared to love again, not because I didn't trust other people, but because I didn't trust myself not to miss the signs. My therapist said, "You will miss some signs. That's not failure, that's being a person. The work isn't to predict betrayal. The work is to believe yourself faster if it comes." She told me to practice with small things, declining invitations I didn't want, saying I'm not comfortable with that without explanation, leaving when I felt talked over. Consent isn't only about bodies, it's about time, attention, presence. I started saying no like a complete sentence. The world did not end. One evening, the kids from the program hosted a showcase for potential employers. I ironed a shirt I saved for days I need extra luck and ran through the checklist twice: name tags, portfolio table, water, spare ties. The room filled with city officials and HR managers and the kind of people who wear lanyards like armor. I watched our cohort shake hands and tell the true story of themselves they'd practiced. I watched shoulders drop when a conversation went well, watched cheeks flush when someone said, "Email me Monday." It felt like officiating a series of small weddings, commitments being made to futures in rooms where no one was getting left. And then I saw her. Not a trumpet blast, not a zoom-in and swell of strings. Just a woman reading the table signs, brow furrowed in that earnest way I like because it means a person is actually thinking. She wore a navy dress with pockets feel like integrity, and her hair was up like a promise to get things done. She laughed with one of our mentors and shook Jamal's hand and took a flyer like she meant to actually read it. When she looked up, we made eye contact in that accidental, polite way strangers do when sharing a space. She smiled like a human being, not an invitation, and looked back to the board. I told myself to keep moving, plates to refill, cables to tape, speeches to avoid, but she drifted toward our table and I heard myself say, "Careful with the tape there, the floor eats it," which is not flirting, it's facilities advice. She grinned. "Noted, I'm Noor," she said, each letter landing like a step on solid ground. "We brought a team from the civic lab, your kids are impressive." "Zaid," I said, "they're not kids anymore, they keep reminding me." "Good," she said, "adults should stop being surprised when young people are competent." Then she asked questions that were not polite fillers. How long had we been running the program? What were our outcomes beyond employment? What did we need that the city wasn't providing? She listened without looking over my shoulder. When I answered, I noticed my hands were steady and my voice didn't try to audition for a role I wasn't sure I wanted. We were two people doing a thing we both cared about. It felt like standing in a room with windows open. Someone called her name and she excused herself with a "let me not monopolize your time," which charmed me more than anything else she could have said. On her way out, she scribbled something on a sticky note and slid it onto the portfolio table. Later, when we were stacking chairs and Ezra was pretending not to be curious, I picked it up. Coffee to talk about pipelines, not destiny. N, a number, no flourish. My heart did a cautious thing, like a dog sniffing a stranger's hand before deciding to sit. I didn't call that night. The old me would have, lunging toward the idea of a future to suffocate the past. The man I am now waited 2 days and then texted, "Pipelines over destiny sounds like my speed." "Thursday," she wrote back, "Thursday, I'll bring a notebook." We met at a place with concrete floors and plants heavy as chandeliers. She was 10 minutes late because a bus broke down, and she apologized in a sentence that didn't try to buy my forgiveness with charm. We talked funding models and accountability. We debated universal basic income like two people who know it won't fix everything, and also that it's not nothing. We told the stories that interviewed our values without putting our wounds on the table like appetizers. When she laughed, it didn't ask me to be someone funnier. When she disagreed, it didn't make me smaller. At one point she said, "Are you married?" like a person gathering relevant data, not a person reaching for gossip. I looked at the steam rising from my cup and said, I'm not, it ended badly." She nodded once and didn't flinch like she wanted the bad for entertainment. "Then I won't ask you for a timeline or a villain," she said. "Just tell me if there are any rooms I shouldn't open by accident." I felt something in me unclench that I didn't know I was holding. "A few," I said. We walked out into a dusk that made the city generous. At the corner she said, "I like that your answers are sentences, not auditions." I said, "I like that your questions don't try to be traps." We stood there in that pleasant, awkward moment that used to make me jump to fill silence with an offer, a promise, a future. This time I let the air be air. "Can I call you?" I asked simply. To continue the argument about pipelines, maybe also the coffee. She smiled. "Call me," she said. Then she crossed the street and didn't look back with theatrical timing. She just went where she was going. I went home without narrating it to myself in capital letters. I did the dishes. I took out the recycling. I wrote coffee with N, argued about good things on a scrap and dropped it in the first jar. I sat on the couch and realized I wasn't composing a speech for an audience that doesn't exist. I was living a Tuesday. Ezra texted later, "How'd the showcase go?" I sent him a photo of Jamal and his offer letter. He sent back a thumbs up and nothing else. It felt like progress that didn't require me to clap. Before bed, I took the small bowl with the rings out of the drawer where I'd put it months ago. I set it on the table, looked at it, and then took the rings out and placed them in an envelope addressed to myself at my office with a note. For the archive, not the exhibit. In the morning, I would drop it in the mailroom so future me could find them someday as proof, not as a shrine. I turned off the lights and the room didn't feel like it was waiting to catch me off guard. If you're still listening here, where I'll leave you for now, standing on a quiet balcony with the city breathing, a phone that might ring, a brother learning to stack chairs before speaking, a mother who sings while she stirs, a program that turns kids into colleagues, and a man who no longer needs to be saved by the next thing to believe he's worth saving. I don't know if Nor is a beginning or a lesson or both. I don't know which rooms will open or keep closed. I know that when hope slips under the door, you don't have to interrogate it on sight. You can let it warm the floor a little, see if it stays. Tell me this in the comments because I want to know how your bones vote when your brain is undecided. After betrayal, is it braver to forgive the person who broke you or to forgive yourself for not seeing it sooner? The next morning, the city looked different, not because the skyline had changed, but because my chest had. I brewed tea instead of coffee like my mother does when she wants clarity more than speed. I sat at the kitchen table with the steam rising and thought about Nor. The way her questions had been sharp but not cruel. The way she'd left space for silence without trying to fix it. It wasn't love, it wasn't even possibility yet. It was something smaller, humbler, proof that my heart could still recognize warmth without mistaking it for fire. At work, Jamal burst into the office with his first paycheck in hand. "I bought my mom groceries with my own money," he announced, grinning like he'd been crowned king. The room clapped for him, not politely but loudly, like every hand was beating back the story that once told him he'd never make it. I thought of Ezra in the corner, stacking chairs without asking for credit, and realized that sometimes the universe does its justice in side notes, not headlines. That weekend, I went running again, this time alone. The river path was busy, kids on bikes, couples walking, dogs pulling at leashes. I kept my pace steady, remembering my father's voice, "Look where you want to go, not where you're scared of." At mile 3, I slowed, bent over, and laughed, not because I was happy exactly, but because my body felt alive, and that was enough. Later, I visited my parents. Mom was kneading dough, humming a hymn, and Dad was fixing a door hinge that didn't even need fixing. Ezra was there too, hammer in hand, his shoulders rounded in a way I'd never seen before. He looked at me, waiting for permission to exist in the same room. I nodded once, and we both got on with our tasks. No speeches, no apologies, just wood, nails, flour, and silence that didn't demand anything of me. That night, back in my apartment, I found myself staring at the phone. Nor's number glowed in my call log. My hand hovered, not out of desperation but curiosity. I thought about what my therapist had said. The work isn't to predict betrayal, the work is to believe yourself faster if it comes. So I pressed call. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm but not expectant. "Hey, pipelines or coffee?" "Both," I said, smiling into the dark, "but maybe also a walk." There was a pause, then her laugh light like glass that had learned to bend instead of break. "Thursday evening," she said, "bring your arguments." When I hung up, I didn't rush to imagine the future. I let it be what it was, an invitation, not a promise. I pulled the jar of firsts off the shelf, wrote "called someone without fear" on a scrap of paper and dropped it in. The sound it made was small, but in my chest it echoed like thunder. If you've ever been broken by the people you trusted most, here's what I know now. Survival is not about proving them wrong. It's about proving yourself right, that you deserved better, that you still do, that you always will. And maybe, just maybe, the bravest thing isn't learning to trust someone else again. It's learning to trust yourself enough to try.